Twin daughters kidnapped. She begs millionaire CEO ex-husband to pay ransom. He refuses. We have your daughters. The words hit Sophia Chun-Wellington like a physical blow as she gripped her phone with trembling hands. Emma and Grace are safe for now, but that depends entirely on you following our instructions exactly. Please, I'll do anything. Just don't hurt them. $2 million. 48 hours. No police, no FBI, no tricks. Just money. I don't have that kind of money. I can't possibly. Then find someone who does. Or you'll never see your daughters again. The line went dead, leaving Sophia staring at her phone in a modest Queens apartment, knowing there was only one person in the world who could save her children. The millionaire ex-husband who had already made it clear he considered her and their daughters inconvenient expenses from his past life. 30 minutes later, Marcus Wellington sat in his Manhattan penthouse, listening to his ex-wife's desperate plea with cold calculation. Marcus, please. They have Emma and Grace. The kidnappers want $2 million in 2 days, or they'll... Not my problem, Sophia. They're your daughters. They're your responsibility now. You wanted full custody, remember? This isn't about custody. This is about saving our children's lives. My children live with me in safety and security. Your children apparently live somewhere dangerous enough to get kidnapped. That's a choice you made. What Marcus didn't know was that Sophia was recording every word of their conversation. What he also didn't know was that his refusal to save his own daughters would be broadcast to the world within hours, destroying everything he'd built his identity on. But most importantly, what he didn't know was that 12-year-old Emma and Grace Wellington were far smarter than anyone gave them credit for, and they had been planning for exactly this kind of betrayal for months. Have you ever watched someone reveal their true character when innocent lives hung in the balance? Have you seen what happens when money becomes more important than family, when calculation replaces compassion? Today's story will show you how one man's refusal to save his own children exposed him as a monster, and how 2 brilliant 12-year-olds orchestrated the most shocking revenge ever captured on camera. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. The kidnapping wasn't what it seemed, the ransom wasn't what it appeared, and the real villain wasn't who everyone thought it was. If you're ready for a story about the lengths a mother will go to save her children, about the intelligence of kids who refuse to be victims, and about how cruelty always finds a way to destroy itself, hit that like button right now. And make sure you're subscribed to Lux Love Chronicles, because this story will show you that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected sources. To understand the man who would refuse to pay ransom for his own daughters, you need to understand how Marcus Wellington built his empire and what he was willing to sacrifice to maintain it. Marcus hadn't been born wealthy. The son of a small-town pharmacist in rural Pennsylvania, he'd worked his way through medical school and business school with a burning ambition that bordered on obsession. But unlike others who climbed from humble beginnings with gratitude for their opportunities, Marcus developed a worldview that success justified any means necessary to achieve it. The weak get devoured by the strong. He'd tell his business school classmates over drinks that he calculated down to the penny for tax purposes. The only question is whether you're going to be predator or prey. By 30, Marcus had abandoned his brief medical practice to focus on the business side of healthcare. He'd identified a simple truth that would make him fantastically wealthy. Sick people would pay anything to get better, and insurance companies would pay anything to avoid covering expensive treatments. Wellington Pharmaceuticals started as a small company that bought patents for life-saving medications, then raised prices by 1,000% or more overnight. When diabetes patients couldn't afford insulin that had cost $5 to manufacture but sold for $500, Marcus called it market optimization. When parents went bankrupt paying for their children's cancer medications, he called it maximizing shareholder value. Healthcare is a business, not a charity, became his motto. It was printed on motivational posters throughout Wellington Pharmaceuticals headquarters, reminding employees that their mission was profit, not healing. By 35, Marcus was worth $200 million and had earned a reputation as one of the most ruthless operators in an industry already known for its callousness. He testified before Congress about drug pricing with the same cold calculation he brought to board meetings, explaining to senators that sick people should be grateful for any access to medications, regardless of price. Innovation requires investment. He'd tell congressional committees while families in the gallery held photos of loved ones who had died because they couldn't afford his company's medications. If we don't maintain profit margins that justify research and development, these medications won't exist at all. It was technically true and completely heartless. Exactly the combination that had made Marcus successful in an industry that rewarded both. But Marcus's greatest asset wasn't his business acumen or his medical knowledge. It was his complete inability to see other people as anything more than variables in equations designed to maximize his profit. This sociopathic efficiency served him well in business negotiations and hostile takeovers. It served him less well in personal relationships, though it took him years to understand why. Marcus met Dr. Sophia Chun during his brief stint as a practicing physician, before he discovered that treating patients was far less profitable than exploiting them. She was a pediatric resident at Johns Hopkins, brilliant and compassionate in ways that initially attracted him because they seemed exotic. "You really care about these kids, don't you?" he asked after watching her spend 3 unpaid hours comforting a family whose child was facing a difficult surgery. "Of course I care about them. Don't you? I care about providing quality medical care. But getting emotionally involved with every patient seems inefficient." "Marcus, these aren't patients. They're children. And that's not inefficient, that's human." At the time, he'd found her emotional investment charming in the way one might find a puppy's enthusiasm endearing. Sophia represented everything he'd never been: naturally empathetic, genuinely caring, motivated by helping others rather than helping herself. She was also beautiful, intelligent, and from a respectable family that would enhance his social standing as he transitioned from medicine to business. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, it was as much a strategic merger as a romantic gesture. "I want to build something extraordinary together," he told her as he presented a ring that cost more than most people's annual salary. "I want us to be the kind of power couple that changes the world." "I want that too," Sophia replied, because she loved him and believed in the vision of partnership he was describing. For the first few years of their marriage, that vision seemed achievable. Sophia supported Marcus's transition from medicine to business, understanding that his pharmaceutical company could potentially help more people than his individual medical practice ever could. She gave up her own medical career to support his ambitions, hosting dinner parties for his investors, managing their social calendar, and providing the kind of stable, elegant home life that impressed business partners and enhanced his professional reputation. "Sophia is my secret weapon," Marcus would tell colleagues. "She understands the medical side of our business in ways that give us credibility with doctors and hospitals." When the twins were born, Emma arriving 8 minutes before Grace on a snowy February morning, Marcus seemed genuinely excited about fatherhood. "They're going to have every advantage," he said, holding his daughters for the first time. "The best schools, the best opportunities, the best of everything money can buy." "They're going to have love," Sophia replied. "That's more important than advantages. They're going to have both." For the first few years, it seemed like they might. Marcus was present for bedtime stories and weekend family activities. He attended school plays and parent-teacher conferences. He seemed to understand that being a father required emotional investment, not just financial provision. But as Wellington Pharmaceuticals grew and Marcus's wealth multiplied, his priorities began to shift in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. "I need to miss Emma's recital tonight," he announced one Thursday evening when the twins were 6 years old. "There's an emergency board meeting about the Morrison acquisition. Can't someone else handle it?" "Sophia, this deal is worth $40 million. Emma's recital will be recorded. I can watch it later." "That's not the same as being there. It's better. I can fast forward through the parts that aren't her performance." The comment revealed everything about how Marcus had come to view family life as something to be optimized for efficiency rather than experienced for connection. The missed recital became missed birthday parties, which became missed family vacations, which became a pattern of absence that taught Emma and Grace that their father's work was always more important than their needs. "Where's Daddy?" became the question Sophia dreaded most, because the answer was always the same: making money at the expense of making memories. The final destruction of their marriage happened gradually, then suddenly. Marcus's company went public when the twins were 8, making him worth over $500 million overnight. Instead of celebrating this milestone as financial security that would allow him to spend more time with family, Marcus treated it as validation that his approach to life was correct. "We're in the big leagues now," he told Sophia after the IPO celebration. "This means I need to be even more focused, even more strategic about every decision." What about balance? What about family time? Family time is a luxury for people who don't have the responsibilities I have. Your responsibilities to your shareholders don't override your responsibilities to your daughters, don't they? Because my shareholders' investments fund the lifestyle Emma and Grace enjoy. Private schools, music lessons, summer camps. All of that costs money that comes from my work. They'd rather have their father present than their lifestyle funded. That's easy to say when you've never worried about money. It was a cruel comment that revealed how Marcus viewed Sophia's financial dependence on him, not as a choice she'd made to support his career, but as a weakness that disqualified her from having opinions about family priorities. The arguments became more frequent and more bitter. Marcus accused Sophia of not understanding the pressure he was under. Sophia accused Marcus of using work as an excuse to avoid emotional intimacy with his family. "You're never present when you're here," she told him during one particularly heated fight. "Even when you're physically in the same room, you're checking emails or taking calls or thinking about deals. I'm providing for my family. You're avoiding your family. This is temporary. Once I establish Wellington as a dominant player in the market, there will always be another market to dominate, another company to acquire, another reason why this particular moment isn't the right time to be a husband and father." That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you had a conversation with Emma or Grace that wasn't about their grades or their schedules? When was the last time you asked them how they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they're worried about? Marcus couldn't answer because he couldn't remember. Somewhere in his climb to the top of the pharmaceutical industry, he'd stopped seeing his daughters as people and started seeing them as dependents, expensive ones who required financial support but not emotional investment. The divorce proceedings were brutal, even by the standards of high-net-worth separations. Marcus hired the most expensive divorce attorneys in the state and fought every aspect of Sophia's requests as if they were hostile takeover attempts. "She wants 50% of everything," he told his lead attorney, Richard Blackstone, as if this was an outrageous demand rather than standard divorce law. "She's entitled to half the marital assets, Marcus. She supported your career for 15 years. She didn't build this company. She didn't negotiate the deals. She didn't take the risks. She raised your children and managed your household while you built your empire. That's partnership. That's what wives are supposed to do." The final settlement gave Sophia a fraction of what she was legally entitled to, but she'd been so exhausted by Marcus's scorched earth tactics that she'd accepted less just to escape the marriage. She got their modest suburban home, a monthly support payment that barely covered the twins' expenses, and primary custody with Marcus having visitation rights every other weekend. "You'll regret this," Marcus told her the day she signed the papers. "You'll never find anyone who can provide for you and the girls the way I did. I don't want someone to provide for me, Marcus. I want someone to love me. Love doesn't pay for college tuition. Love shows up for school plays and soccer games. Money is a poor substitute for presence." 3 years later, Marcus was worth $800 million and felt vindicated in every choice he'd made. His company was one of the most profitable in the pharmaceutical industry. He owned properties on 4 continents, and he was regularly featured in business magazines as a model of entrepreneurial success. He was also profoundly alone, though he told himself that was a choice rather than a consequence. His relationship with Emma and Grace had become purely transactional. Expensive gifts at Christmas and birthdays, luxury vacations during his custody weekends, and private school tuition payments that he considered generous despite their representing less than he spent on his wine collection. "Are you happy, Daddy?" Emma had asked him during one of their scheduled visits to his penthouse. "I'm successful, sweetheart. That's more important than happy." "Why?" "Because success takes care of everyone in the family. Happiness is just a feeling. But feelings matter. Feelings don't pay bills." It was exactly the kind of response that had taught his daughters their father valued money more than their emotional well-being. It was also the kind of response that would come back to haunt him when they needed him most, and he chose calculation over compassion one final, fatal time. Tuesday, October 15th started like any other school day in the modest Queens neighborhood where Sophia had rebuilt her life after the divorce. Emma and Grace Wellington, now 12 years old and in 7th grade, walked the familiar 6 blocks from their public school to their mother's small apartment, backpacks heavy with homework and heads full of typical preteen concerns. The twins had grown into remarkable young women despite, or perhaps because of, their complicated family situation. Emma was the more outgoing of the two, quick with jokes and fiercely protective of anyone she perceived as vulnerable. Grace was quieter, more analytical, with an almost eerie ability to read people's motivations and predict their behavior. Both girls were honor students who had learned to navigate between two completely different worlds. Their mother's modest but warm home in Queens, where love was abundant but money was carefully managed, and their father's sterile luxury penthouse in Manhattan, where every material want was satisfied but emotional connection was as rare as their father's presence. "Do you think Dad will actually come to the science fair this time?" Emma asked as they walked past the bodega where Mrs. Kim always had a smile and sometimes a free piece of candy for neighborhood kids. "He said he would," Grace replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't holding her breath. "He said he'd come to my piano recital too, and your soccer championship, and Mom's birthday dinner." "I know. So why do we keep believing him?" Grace considered this with the seriousness she brought to all questions about their father. "Because believing is easier than accepting that he doesn't care as much as we wish he did." It was a remarkably mature insight for a 12-year-old, born from years of watching their father prioritize everything except his children. They were 3 blocks from home, discussing whether to stop at the library to work on their joint science project about pharmaceutical ethics, a topic they'd chosen specifically to try to connect with their father's work, when the black van pulled up beside them. Everything happened quickly and professionally. 2 men in ordinary clothes approached from different angles, one distracting the girls with questions about directions while the other moved into position behind them. "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the subway station?" the first man asked in perfectly normal, unaccented English. "It's 2 blocks that way," Emma replied politely, pointing east while Grace instinctively stepped closer to her sister. "Thanks. Hey, aren't you the Wellington twins?" The question should have been a warning, but it wasn't unusual for people to recognize them. Their father's business success had made the family name familiar in certain circles, and the bitter divorce had been covered in local media. "Yes," Emma said, still trying to be polite despite Grace's obvious discomfort. "Your dad's Marcus Wellington, the pharmaceutical guy?" "Yes. Thought so. You girls need to come with us." The second man moved swiftly, and within seconds both girls found themselves being guided firmly, but not roughly, toward the open van door. The entire interaction took less than 30 seconds and appeared to casual observers like adults helping children with something routine. "Let us go," Grace said loudly enough to attract attention, but not screaming in a way that would suggest panic. "Everything's fine," the first man said in a voice meant to reassure any passers-by. "Your mom sent us to pick you up. There's been a family emergency." It was the perfect lie, reasonable enough to explain the girl's obvious reluctance, while urgent enough to justify the hurried departure. Emma and Grace found themselves in the back of the van, not tied up or restrained, but clearly unable to leave. The interior was clean and ordinary, like a contractor's work vehicle, with no obvious signs that it was being used for kidnapping. "Are you going to hurt us?" Emma asked with the directness that was her trademark. "Not if everyone does what they're supposed to do," replied the man who seemed to be in charge. He was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and spoke like someone accustomed to running meetings rather than committing crimes. "What do you want?" "We want your father to pay attention to something important." "Our father doesn't pay attention to us." "Why would he pay attention to you?" The man looked surprised by Grace's matter-of-fact response. "He'll pay attention to this." "You don't know our father very well," Emma said. "The last time Mom called him about an emergency, he said it wasn't his problem anymore. This is different." "How?" "Because this time, there are consequences if he doesn't respond." The girls exchanged a look that their kidnappers didn't understand, but would later wish they had. Emma and Grace had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation for months, ever since Grace had overheard a conversation between their parents about threats Marcus had been receiving related to his business practices. Hidden in Emma's backpack was a small recording device they'd bought with their allowance money. Sewn into the lining of Grace's jacket was a GPS tracker they'd ordered online. Both girls had memorized their mother's lawyer's phone number, their father's assistant's direct line, and the procedure for contacting FBI agents who specialized in kidnapping cases. They weren't just victims being taken by surprise. They were intelligent, prepared children who had anticipated that their father's business enemies might eventually target his family. What they hadn't anticipated was that their father would choose money over their lives when the moment of crisis finally arrived. Sophia Chinwellington was preparing dinner in her small Queen's kitchen when her phone rang at 6:47 p.m. She expected it to be Emma or Grace calling to say they'd stopped at the library or were walking home with friends, the normal check-ins that responsible 12-year-olds make with their mothers. Instead, she heard a man's voice she didn't recognize. "Dr. Chinwellington? Yes, who is this? We have your daughters." The words didn't register at first. Sophia's mind rejected the information as impossible, the kind of thing that happened to other families in other places, not to her children in their safe Queens neighborhood. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Emma and Grace are with us. They're safe for now, but that depends entirely on you following our instructions exactly." The phone slipped from Sophia's hand, clattering to the kitchen floor as the reality hit her like a physical blow. Her children, her brilliant, funny, beloved daughters, had been taken by strangers who wanted something from her. "Please," she whispered into the phone after picking it up with shaking hands. "Please don't hurt them. I'll do anything. Just tell me what you want." $2 million. "You have 48 hours to get the money together." "I don't have that kind of money." "I can't possibly." "Then find someone who does. Your ex-husband, for instance. Marcus Wellington can afford $2 million. He won't pay it. You don't understand our relationship. Make him understand that his daughters' lives depend on it." "Can I talk to them? Can I hear their voices?" There was a pause. Then Emma's voice came on the line, steady despite the circumstances. "Mom, we're okay. These men haven't hurt us, but they're serious about the money." "Emma, sweetheart, are you and Grace hurt?" "We're fine." "But Mom, you need to call Dad right away. These people know things about his business." Grace's voice came next. "Mom, tell Dad this isn't just about money. Tell him it's about the Morrison Industries deal." The line went dead before Sophia could respond, but Grace's message was clear enough. This kidnapping was connected to Marcus's business dealings in ways that made it more than a random crime. Sophia sat in her kitchen for 5 minutes, paralyzed by terror and the magnitude of what she needed to do. Then she forced herself to move, to think, to act like the competent woman she'd been before her marriage to Marcus had slowly eroded her confidence. She called Marcus's direct line, the number she'd used only 3 times in the past year, and only for true emergencies involving the twins. "This better be important, Sophia. I'm in the middle of dinner with investors. Marcus, Emma, and Grace have been kidnapped." Silence. "Then, what are you talking about?" "They were taken this afternoon, walking home from school. The kidnappers want $2 million in 48 hours, or they'll kill them." "That's impossible. Kidnapping doesn't happen to people like us." "It just did happen to people like us. To our children." "Have you called the police?" The kidnappers said no police, no FBI. Just money. $2 million. "Yes. That's ridiculous. No one pays that kind of ransom for kidnapping victims." The callousness of the response, referring to their daughters as kidnapping victims rather than our children, revealed everything Sophia needed to know about how this conversation would go. "Marcus, they're our daughters. Our 12-year-old daughters who are terrified and alone with criminals who could kill them. Which is exactly why we don't negotiate with terrorists. Paying ransom just encourages more kidnappings. This isn't about encouraging anything. This is about saving Emma and Grace." "Sophia, think rationally. $2 million is an enormous amount of money. You spend more than that on art for your penthouse. Art is an investment. Ransom payments are just rewards for criminal behavior. You're talking about our children like they're a business expense. I'm talking about them like a father who understands that giving in to criminal demands puts them in more danger, not less. You're talking about them like a man who values money more than his daughters' lives." The accusation hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Sophia waited for Marcus to deny it, to express outrage at the suggestion, to demonstrate some trace of normal parental fear and protective instinct. Instead, he said the three words that would haunt her forever: "Not my problem." "What did you just say?" "I said it's not my problem. You have custody, Sophia. You chose to live in a dangerous neighborhood. You chose to send them to public school instead of private school with proper security. You made the decisions that led to this situation. You're blaming me for our daughters being kidnapped. I'm stating facts. My daughters live with me in a secure building with doormen and cameras. Your daughters walk home alone through Queens. The difference in risk was your choice. Our daughters live with me because you were never present enough to be a real father. And now you want me to pay for the consequences of your poor judgment. I want you to pay to save their lives. $2 million to reward criminal behavior that will only encourage more kidnappings? I don't think so. Marcus, please. I'm begging you. If you ever love them, if you have any decency left, please help me save our children." My answer is no. And Sophia? Next time you call me with a crisis, make sure it's actually my responsibility to solve. The line went dead, leaving Sophia staring at her phone in complete disbelief. Her ex-husband, the father of her children, had just refused to pay ransom to save their daughters' lives. But what Marcus didn't know was that Sophia had recorded every word of their conversation on an app that was already uploading the audio to social media platforms where it would be heard by millions of people within hours. What he also didn't know was that Emma and Grace Wellington were far more prepared for this situation than anyone realized, and they had plans that would expose truths about their kidnapping and their father that would destroy him in ways he never saw coming. If you're shocked by Marcus's refusal to save his own daughters and want to see how this devastating story unfolds, hit that like button. We're just getting started with this story of parental betrayal and children's courage. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will show you exactly how intelligence and preparation can overcome wealth and cruelty. Drop a comment and tell us, what would you do in Sophia's situation? How far would you go to save your children when the people who should help you refuse? After Marcus hung up on her, Sophia sat in her kitchen for exactly 3 minutes, allowing herself to feel the full weight of her ex-husband's betrayal. Then she did something that would change everything. She picked up her phone and went live on every social media platform she had. "My name is Sophia Wellington, and 47 minutes ago, my 12-year-old twin daughters Emma and Grace were kidnapped," she began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "The kidnappers are demanding $2 million in ransom, and I just got off the phone with their father, my ex-husband Marcus Wellington, the pharmaceutical CEO worth $800 million. She held up her phone, playing the recorded conversation for her growing audience. "Not my problem," Marcus's voice echoed through the live stream, followed by his cold calculation about risk and responsibility. The comments section exploded immediately. He said, "What about his own daughters? This man is a monster. Someone please tell me this isn't real. How can a father refuse to save his children?" Within 20 minutes, Sophia's live stream had been shared across TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Major news outlets picked up the story within an hour. Hashtag Save Emma and Grace started trending globally. "I have 36 hours left to raise $2 million, Sophia continued, her desperation raw and real. "I've already sold my car, my jewelry, everything of value I own. I've called every friend, every family member, every colleague from my medical career. I'm still $1.8 million short." The livestream viewer count climbed past 100,000, then 500,000, then 1 million people watching a mother beg for help to save her children while their billionaire father refused to open his wallet. "These are Emma and Grace," Sophia said, holding up recent photos of her daughters. "They're honor students. They volunteer at the local animal shelter. Emma wants to be a marine biologist, and Grace wants to be a civil rights lawyer. They're kind, brilliant, beautiful girls who don't deserve to die because their father values money more than their lives." Donations began pouring into the GoFundMe account Sophia had hastily created. $5, $50, $500 from strangers around the world who were horrified by Marcus's callousness and moved by a mother's desperation. But even with thousands of people contributing, the total was climbing slowly. After 4 hours of viral sharing and global outrage, the fundraiser had reached only $347,000, still more than $1 million short, with less than 32 hours remaining. Meanwhile, Marcus Wellington was learning what it felt like to be the most hated man in America. Marcus first learned about Sophia's livestream from his head of public relations, Jennifer Park, who called him at 11:30 p.m. with panic in her voice. "Marcus, we have a crisis. A major, potentially company-ending crisis." "What kind of crisis?" "Your ex-wife's livestream about your daughter's kidnapping has gone viral. 8 million views and climbing. Every major news outlet is covering it. The audio of you refusing to pay ransom is being played on repeat across every platform." "She recorded me? That's illegal." "Actually, it's not. New York is a one-party consent state. And even if it were illegal, that's not our problem right now. Our problem is that you've become the face of wealthy male sociopathy." Marcus pulled up social media on his phone and immediately understood the scope of the disaster. His name was trending worldwide, but not in a good way. Hashtag Marcus Wellington is a monster had over 2 million posts. Someone had created a compilation video of his worst quotes from the phone call, set to heartbreaking music and photos of Emma and Grace. The business implications were immediate and devastating. Wellington Pharmaceuticals' stock price had dropped 18% in after-hours trading. 3 major clients had already issued statements reassessing their partnerships with the company. The board of directors was demanding an emergency meeting. "Fix this," Marcus told Jennifer. "Issue a statement. Clarify my position." "What position exactly? That you won't pay ransom to save your daughter's lives? That I don't negotiate with terrorists? That paying ransom encourages more kidnappings? Marcus, these are your children we're talking about. 12-year-old girls who are being held by criminals. There is no position that makes your response look reasonable. Then spin it differently. Make it about the principle of not rewarding criminal behavior. The only thing more tone-deaf than refusing to save your daughters would be doubling down on that refusal with a press release." But Marcus was nothing if not consistent in his complete lack of emotional intelligence. Against Jennifer's advice, he authorized a statement that would complete his public destruction. Marcus Wellington stands firm in his belief that negotiating with criminals endangers more families in the long term. While this situation is personally difficult, paying ransom money only encourages more kidnappings and puts other children at risk. Mr. Wellington hopes for his daughter's safe return, but cannot in good conscience reward criminal behavior that could lead to more such incidents. The statement was released at midnight and immediately became one of the most ratioed press releases in social media history. The comments were savage. "This man just called his daughter's kidnapping personally difficult, like it's a scheduling conflict. He's more concerned about encouraging kidnappings than saving his own children. Someone worth $800 million won't pay $2 million to save his daughters. Evil doesn't even cover this." Major media outlets eviscerated both Marcus and his statement. CNN ran a segment titled, "When Wealth Becomes Inhumane, The Marcus Wellington Story." Fox News, typically sympathetic to successful businessmen, called his response morally bankrupt. The New York Times editorial board published a piece called "The Price of Greed: How One Man's Cruelty Exposed the Moral Bankruptcy of Extreme Wealth." Late-night talk show hosts had a field day. Saturday Night Live wrote an entire sketch about a billionaire who calculates the cost-benefit analysis of saving his own children. The sketch ended with the characters saying, "Sorry kids, the numbers just don't add up." But the most damaging coverage came from an unexpected source, Marcus's own employees. Dr. Sarah Kim, who had worked for Wellington Pharmaceuticals for 8 years, posted a viral TikTok video from inside the company's headquarters. "I work for Marcus Wellington, and I want everyone to know what kind of man he really is. This is someone who raised the price of insulin by 400% overnight, and said diabetic children should be grateful for access at any price. This is someone who bought the patent for a childhood cancer medication and increased the cost from $40 to $4,000 per dose. And now he's refusing to pay ransom to save his own daughters because it might encourage criminal behavior. This man has spent his entire career putting money before human life. Why would his own children be any different?" The video was viewed 12 million times in 6 hours and prompted a flood of similar testimonies from current and former Wellington Pharmaceuticals employees, painting a picture of a CEO whose callousness towards sick children was perfectly consistent with his callousness toward his own daughters. By morning, Marcus Wellington had become the most universally despised person in America. Protesters gathered outside Wellington Pharmaceuticals headquarters holding signs reading, "Save Emma and Grace," and "Money can't buy decency." The company's stock price had dropped 38%, wiping out billions in shareholder value. But Marcus's public destruction was nothing compared to what his daughters were planning for him. While the world raged at their father's cruelty and their mother desperately tried to raise ransom money, Emma and Grace Wellington were putting into action a plan they'd been developing for months. The twins weren't typical 12-year-olds. Growing up between two worlds, their mother's modest but loving home and their father's cold luxury had forced them to develop sophisticated survival skills at an unusually young age. They'd learned to read adult emotions, to understand power dynamics, and to plan for contingencies that most children never have to consider. Grace, in particular, had an almost uncanny ability to analyze people's motivations and predict their behavior. She'd known for months that their father's business practices were making enemies, and she'd overheard enough conversations between their parents to understand that those enemies might eventually target Marcus's family. "We need to be prepared," she told Emma 6 months earlier after overhearing Sophia on the phone with a lawyer, discussing security concerns related to Marcus's business dealings. Prepared for what? For someone trying to use us to hurt Dad? Or for Dad not caring enough to protect us when it happens? Emma had initially thought Grace was being paranoid. But as they spent more time observing their father's complete emotional detachment during their custody visits, she'd begun to understand that Grace's fears were entirely rational. So they'd prepared. They'd bought small recording devices and GPS trackers with their allowance money. They'd memorized important phone numbers and emergency procedures. They'd even practiced staying calm under pressure by role-playing various crisis scenarios. Most importantly, they'd installed secret recording apps on their phones that uploaded audio directly to cloud storage accounts their parents didn't know about. Now, sitting in the back of their kidnapper's van, the twins were implementing their plan with remarkable calm. "Are you getting all this?" Emma whispered to Grace, tapping her phone to indicate the recording app was running. "Everything," Grace whispered back, "including the conversation they had before we got in the van." What the twins had recorded was explosive, a detailed conversation between their kidnappers about who had hired them and why. The Morrison Industries people want Wellington destroyed. The lead kidnapper, a man named Robert Chun, no relation to Sophia, had told his partner. They don't actually care about the money. They want him to refuse to pay ransom so they can use it to destroy his reputation and his company. What if he pays? He won't. They've studied his psychological profile. Marcus Wellington doesn't see his family as people. He sees them as assets. And he won't pay $2 million for assets he doesn't control anymore. And if we're wrong, if he actually pays the ransom, then we return the girls unharmed and Morrison Industries still gets what they want, proof that Wellington can be manipulated through his family. This seems overly complicated. Complicated but foolproof. Either Wellington pays and proves he's vulnerable to family-based extortion, or he refuses and proves he's a monster. Either way, Morrison Industries wins and Wellington Pharmaceuticals gets destroyed. The twins had recorded every word, along with the kidnappers' detailed discussions about their real employer, their backup plans, and their complete lack of intention to actually harm Emma and Grace. Grace had also managed to activate the GPS tracker sewn into her jacket and send a text message to their mother's lawyer with their location coordinates, though she'd been careful to make it look like she was just fidgeting with her phone. "Mr. Chun," Grace said politely, addressing the lead kidnapper, "can I ask you something?" "What?" "How much is Morrison Industries paying you to kidnap us?" The van went completely silent. Robert Chun stared at Grace in shock, clearly not expecting a 12-year-old to have figured out their real motivation. "What are you talking about? We heard your conversation before you put us in the van. This isn't really about ransom money. Morrison Industries hired you to kidnap us because they want to destroy our father's company. You must have misunderstood." "I didn't misunderstand anything," Emma chimed in with her characteristic directness. "You said Morrison Industries studied our father's psychological profile and predicted he would refuse to pay ransom because he doesn't see us as people. Which means you never intended to hurt us," Grace continued. "You just needed us missing long enough for our father to publicly refuse to save us. thereby destroying his reputation and his company. Robert Chin exchanged a worried look with his partner. These weren't frightened children they could manipulate. These were intelligent young women who had figured out their entire scheme. That's a very creative theory, girls, but it's not a theory, Grace said calmly. It's a fact. And we have recordings of your conversations that prove Morrison Industries orchestrated this kidnapping. We also have GPS tracking that's already sent our location to people who can find us, Emma added. So you might want to reconsider your plan. The kidnappers were beginning to realize they had dramatically underestimated their victims. But the twins weren't finished. Mr. Chun, we have a proposition for you, Grace said with the same tone she might use to negotiate a group project at school. What kind of proposition? We let you complete your mission to destroy our father's reputation, because honestly, he deserves it, but we do it our way, which is smarter and safer for everyone involved. I'm listening. You return us safely to our mother. We provide evidence that Morrison Industries hired you to kidnap us, and everyone wins except the people who actually deserve to lose. Why would you want to destroy your own father? Emma and Grace looked at each other, communicating in the wordless way that twins often do. Because he just proved that he values money more than our lives, Emma said simply. And because someone who refuses to save his own children doesn't deserve to be called a father. What Emma and Grace had stumbled onto was far more complex than a simple kidnapping for ransom scheme. Morrison Industries, one of Wellington Pharmaceuticals' biggest competitors, had been planning Marcus's destruction for over a year as part of a hostile takeover attempt. Morrison's CEO, Patricia Morrison, had identified Marcus's complete lack of emotional connection to his family as a potential weakness that could be exploited. Working with a team of corporate psychologists and private investigators, she developed a plan to create a crisis that would force Marcus to choose between his money and his family, knowing that he would choose money and thereby destroy himself publicly. The beauty of the plan, Robert Chin explained to the twins as they drove toward the warehouse where they were supposed to be held, is that it exposes who your father really is. Morrison Industries doesn't have to destroy his reputation. He destroys it himself by being exactly as heartless as he's always been. But you underestimated us, Grace pointed out. You assumed we'd be passive victims instead of active participants. We did. That was your mistake. We've been planning for this scenario for months because we know our father better than Morrison Industries psychologists do. How so? We know he's not just emotionally detached. He's completely incapable of seeing other people as human beings, including us. Morrison Industries thought that was a weakness they could exploit, but we knew it was just who he is. Emma pulled out her phone, showing Robert Chin the social media explosion around their kidnapping. Look at this. Our father isn't just refusing to pay ransom. He's doubling down with press releases about principles and not negotiating with terrorists. He's destroying himself more thoroughly than Morrison Industries ever could. Which means our plan works better than yours, Grace added. We expose the corporate conspiracy, prove that Morrison Industries hired you to kidnap us, and our father still gets destroyed because he genuinely did refuse to save his own children. What's in it for us? You avoid federal kidnapping charges, which carry a minimum 20-year sentence. Morrison Industries gets exposed for orchestrating the kidnapping of children, which will destroy their company too. And we get justice for having a father who doesn't love us enough to save us. Robert Chun was quiet for a long moment, processing the intelligence and strategic thinking of these 12-year-old girls who had just outmaneuvered a sophisticated corporate conspiracy. You've really thought this through. We've had our entire lives to think about what we'd do if our father abandoned us, Emma said. We just never thought it would be this public. And we never thought we'd have evidence of corporate crime to bargain with, Grace added. But since we do, we might as well use it to make sure everyone who deserves consequences gets them. The twins spent the next hour coaching their kidnappers through the revised plan, demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that would have impressed MBA students twice their age. By the time they reached the warehouse, Robert Chin and his partner had agreed to cooperate fully with Emma and Grace's counterplan. They would return the girls safely, provide evidence of Morrison Industries' involvement, and testify against the corporate executives who had hired them. In return, the twins would ensure that the kidnappers received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation in exposing the larger conspiracy. It was, as Grace noted with satisfaction, A win-win situation for everyone except the people who actually deserve to lose. At 3:17 a.m., exactly 21 hours after Emma and Grace Wellington had been kidnapped, FBI agents surrounded the warehouse where they were supposed to be held captive. What they found defied every expectation about kidnapping cases. The twins were sitting at a table with their kidnappers, calmly organizing evidence and preparing statements for law enforcement. Emma was labeling audio recordings on her phone while Grace was drawing diagrams of the corporate conspiracy on a whiteboard that Robert Chun had found in the abandoned office space. "Are you girls all right?" asked Special Agent Maria Santos, who had been called in to handle what was expected to be a high-profile ransom negotiation. "We're fine," Emma replied cheerfully. "But we have a lot to tell you about who really orchestrated this kidnapping and why. And we have recordings of everything," Grace added, holding up her phone, "including conversations proving that Morrison Industries hired these men to kidnap us as part of a corporate takeover scheme." Agent Santos stared at the scene in bewilderment. In 15 years of handling kidnapping cases, she'd never encountered victims who had turned the tables so completely on their captors. "Let me understand this correctly. You were kidnapped, but you've somehow gathered evidence against the people who hired your kidnappers." "We've been preparing for this scenario for months," Grace explained matter-of-factly. "We knew our father's business practices made enemies, and we knew he wouldn't prioritize our safety over his financial interests. So when it actually happened, we were ready," Emma continued. "We had recording devices, GPS tracking, and a plan for exactly this situation. And it turns out our kidnappers are actually decent people who were hired under false pretenses by Morrison Industries executives," Grace added. "They thought they were participating in corporate espionage, not child endangerment." Agent Santos looked at Robert Chun, who nodded grimly. "Everything they're saying is true. I have documents, recordings, and payment records proving that Morrison Industries CEO Patricia Morrison hired us to stage this kidnapping. The plan was to force Marcus Wellington to choose between paying ransom and maintaining his financial principles," Emma explained. "Morrison Industries psychologists predicted he would refuse to pay, thereby destroying his reputation and making their hostile takeover easier. What they didn't predict was that we would figure out their scheme and use it to expose the corporate conspiracy while still achieving their goal of destroying our father's reputation." Agent Santos was taking notes frantically, trying to keep up with revelations that were rewriting everything she thought she knew about the case. "So Morrison Industries orchestrated your kidnapping as part of a corporate takeover?" "Yes, but our father's response was genuinely his own choice," Grace clarified. "Morrison Industries manipulated the situation, but Marcus Wellington really did refuse to pay ransom to save his own daughters. That part wasn't staged. Which means both our father and Morrison Industries are guilty of crimes," Emma added. "Corporate conspiracy and child endangerment for Morrison Industries, and, well, being a terrible father isn't illegal, but it should be." The twins' evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized. They had recordings of the kidnappers discussing their real employers, documents showing payments from Morrison Industries to Robert Chen's consulting firm, and even photographs of Morrison Industries executives meeting with the kidnappers to plan the operation. "This is the most comprehensive evidence package I've ever seen from kidnapping victims," Agent Santos admitted. "You girls have essentially solved this case yourselves." "We had help," Grace said generously, gesturing toward Robert Chun. "Mr. Chun has been very cooperative once he understood that Morrison Industries lied to him about the nature of this operation. They told us this was corporate espionage designed to gather information about Wellington's business practices," Robert Chun explained. "They never mentioned that we'd be putting children in danger or traumatizing a mother who's already been through enough." When we explained the real impact of what they'd asked him to do, Mr. Chin immediately agreed to cooperate with law enforcement, Emma added. "He's a good person who was manipulated by bad people." Agent Santos was beginning to understand that these weren't typical 12-year-old victims. Emma and Grace Wellington had approached their own kidnapping with the strategic thinking of experienced negotiators and the moral clarity of people who had been preparing for betrayal their entire lives. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now we arrest the Morrison Industries executives who orchestrated this conspiracy. We work out reduced sentences for the kidnappers who are cooperating with our investigation, and we reunite you with your very worried mother. And our father? Your father will have to live with the consequences of his choices. Refusing to pay ransom isn't illegal, but it's certainly been educational for the public. Emma and Grace exchanged a look of satisfaction. Their plan had worked perfectly. The corporate conspiracy was exposed. The kidnappers would receive fair treatment for their cooperation, and Marcus Wellington had revealed his true character to the entire world. Justice, they had learned, sometimes required intelligence and patience rather than just hope and luck. When Agent Santos called Sophia to inform her that Emma and Grace had been found safe and that the kidnapping had been resolved, Sophia was still live streaming to an audience of over 2 million people who had been following the story throughout the night. "They're safe," she sobbed into her phone, speaking to both the FBI agent and her global audience simultaneously. "My daughters are safe and they're coming home." The comments section exploded with relief and celebration. "Thank God they're okay. Those girls are heroes for exposing the conspiracy. Marcus Wellington is still a monster, but at least his daughters are safe. Sophia, you are the strongest mother in the world," but Sophia's vindication was just beginning. As Agent Santos explained the details of what Emma and Grace had uncovered, it became clear that the twins' intelligence and preparation had not only saved themselves, they had exposed a corporate conspiracy that went far beyond their kidnapping. Morrison Industries orchestrated the entire thing, Sophia told her livestream audience, her voice growing stronger as the shock of relief gave way to righteous anger. "They hired criminals to kidnap my daughters as part of a corporate takeover scheme. They used my children as weapons in a business war." The revelation sent shockwaves through the business world. Morrison Industries' stock price collapsed in pre-market trading as investors processed the news that the company's executives had orchestrated the kidnapping of children. Major business partners immediately terminated contracts, and the FBI was preparing to arrest Patricia Morrison and her co-conspirators. But the story that dominated headlines wasn't just about corporate crime. It was about two 12-year-old girls who had outsmarted both their kidnappers and the executives who hired them. Emma and Grace Wellington, the smartest kidnapping victims in history, read the CNN headline. "Twin daughters turn tables on corporate conspiracy," declared the New York Times. 12-year-olds solved their own kidnapping case, announced the Washington Post. The twins had become international heroes, celebrated for their intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking. Their story was being taught in crisis management courses and used as an example of how preparation and clear thinking could overcome even sophisticated criminal conspiracies. But for Sophia, the most important victory wasn't the public recognition or the corporate justice. It was the knowledge that her daughters had survived not just a kidnapping, but the revelation that their father was exactly as callous as they had always suspected. "I'm proud of Emma and Grace for their courage and intelligence," she told her livestream audience as she prepared to leave for the FBI office where her daughters were waiting. "But I'm also heartbroken that they had to use those skills to save themselves from a situation that their father could have prevented but chose not to. The real tragedy here isn't just the kidnapping conspiracy. It's that my daughters learned they can't depend on their father to protect them when they need him most. That's a lesson no child should have to learn, especially not in such a public and traumatic way." The GoFundMe account that had been created to raise ransom money was now being donated to children's safety organizations and family crisis centers. Over $4 million had been raised from people around the world who had been moved by Sophia's desperation and inspired by her daughter's courage. But the most meaningful support came from an unexpected source: Wellington Pharmaceuticals employees who were organizing to remove Marcus from the company he had built. "We can't work for a man who refuses to save his own children," Dr. Sarah Kim announced in a video that was shared across all company communication channels. "Marcus Wellington has proven that he values money over human life, including the lives of his own daughters. We demand his immediate resignation and the installation of leadership that reflects basic human decency." The employee revolt was swift and comprehensive. By morning, over 80% of Wellington Pharmaceutical staff had signed a petition demanding Marcus's removal. The board of directors, already facing massive shareholder lawsuits and regulatory investigations, had no choice but to act. Marcus Wellington's empire was crumbling not because of external attacks, but because he had revealed himself to be so fundamentally lacking in human compassion that even his own employees couldn't stomach working for him. Marcus Wellington woke up on the morning after his daughter's rescue to discover that he had lost everything that mattered to him, though it would take him several more hours to understand that what he considered everything had never actually mattered at all. His phone was buzzing with calls from lawyers, board members, and crisis management specialists, all delivering variations of the same message. His refusal to save his daughters had destroyed not just his reputation, but his entire business empire. The board voted unanimously to remove you as CEO effective immediately. His lawyer, Richard Blackstone, informed him during an emergency conference call. They're also stripping you of your board membership and demanding you sell your shares back to the company at a significant discount. They can't do that. I founded this company. They can't, and they did. The company bylaws include morality clauses that allow for immediate termination in cases of behavior that damages the company's reputation. Refusing to save your kidnapped daughters qualifies. What about my ownership stake? Your employment contract includes clauses that allow the company to force sale of shares in cases of reputational damage that threatens company viability. The stock price has dropped 62% since your daughter's kidnapping became public. How much am I looking at? If you're forced to sell under the reputational damage clause, you'll receive approximately 30 cents on the dollar for your shares. Your $800 million stake will be worth about $240 million. That's theft. That's consequence. Marcus, you've become the most hated man in America. No company can afford to be associated with you. No investor will trust you with their money, and no business partner will risk their reputation working with you. The financial devastation was swift and comprehensive. Marcus's personal investments were hemorrhaging value as fund managers distanced themselves from his toxic reputation. Luxury brands were returning his money and canceling his accounts to avoid association with his name. Even his country club had voted to revoke his membership. The Meadowbrook Country Club regrets to inform you that your membership has been terminated effective immediately. Read a formal letter delivered by courier. The club's mission of supporting family values and community service is incompatible with your recent public statements regarding your daughter's welfare. But the social destruction was even more devastating than the financial losses. Marcus discovered that wealth couldn't buy back respect once you'd revealed yourself to be fundamentally lacking in basic human decency. Former friends wouldn't return his calls. Business colleagues avoided him at public events. Even service workers, doormen, restaurant staff, drivers, treated him with barely concealed contempt after recognizing him from the viral videos. "Aren't you the guy who wouldn't save his own kids?" a taxi driver asked him when he tried to get a ride to his lawyer's office. That's a complicated situation that's been misrepresented in the media. Seemed pretty simple to me. Your kids got kidnapped, and you said it wasn't your problem. It's more nuanced than that. Nah, man. Some things ain't nuanced. You either save your kids, or you don't. You didn't. The driver pulled over and asked Marcus to get out of his cab, refusing payment and refusing service. It was a scene that would repeat dozens of times as Marcus discovered that his reputation had made him unemployable, unserviceable, and unwelcome in most of civilized society. The criminal investigation into Morrison Industries provided some vindication. The corporate conspiracy was real, and Patricia Morrison was facing federal charges for orchestrating the kidnapping. But the public's focus remained on Marcus's choice to abandon his daughters rather than the manipulation that had created the situation. Morrison Industries is guilty of conspiracy and child endangerment, Agent Santos explained to reporters. But Marcus Wellington's response to his daughter's kidnapping was entirely his own choice. No one forced him to refuse to pay ransom. No one forced him to say his children's lives weren't his problem. The investigation also revealed the full scope of Morrison Industries' plan, including psychological profiles they had commissioned about Marcus's likely response to family-based extortion. The Morrison Industries team predicted with 94% confidence that Marcus Wellington would refuse to pay ransom for his children, one of the seized documents revealed. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of valuing financial assets over human relationships, including relationships with immediate family members. The psychological profile was made public during court proceedings, providing clinical confirmation of what the world had already observed. Marcus Wellington was so fundamentally selfish that even corporate enemies could predict his abandonment of his own children. "It's one thing to be a bad father," wrote a New York Times columnist. "It's another thing entirely to be such a predictably bad father that criminals can build business strategies around your callousness." 6 months after their kidnapping, Emma and Grace Wellington were thriving in ways that surprised even their mother. The trauma of being kidnapped had been overshadowed by the empowerment of having rescued themselves and exposed the adults who had tried to use them as pawns. "How are you processing everything that happened?" asked Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the family therapist who had been helping them navigate the aftermath of their ordeal. "Better than expected," Grace replied with her characteristic analytical precision. "The kidnapping was scary, but it was also validating." "Validating how?" "It proved that our instincts about our father were correct. We'd been preparing for him to abandon us in a crisis, and when the crisis came, he did exactly what we expected." That sounds very mature for a 13-year-old. "Growing up with Marcus Wellington as a father teaches you to be mature quickly," Emma added. "We learned early that we couldn't depend on him for emotional support, so we learned to depend on each other and on Mom." The twins had indeed turned 13 in the months following their kidnapping, and their birthday celebration had been a stark contrast to previous years when Marcus would send expensive gifts but rarely attend in person. This year, Sophia had thrown them a party in their Queens apartment with their friends from school, homemade cake, and simple presents chosen with love rather than purchased with money. Emma and Grace had declared it the best birthday they'd ever had. "We realized that we prefer authentic love to expensive gifts," Grace explained to Dr. Martinez. "Our father never understood the difference." "Do you miss him?" The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications before Emma answered. "We miss the idea of having a father who loves us. But we don't miss Marcus Wellington specifically, because he never actually loved us in the first place." "How can you be so certain?" "Because people who love you don't abandon you when you need them most," Grace said simply. "And people who love you don't require media pressure to care about your welfare." The kidnapping had made Emma and Grace minor celebrities, featured in documentaries about child safety and intelligence. They had used their platform to advocate for other children in crisis situations, establishing a foundation that provided resources for kids whose parents had abandoned them emotionally or financially. The Wellington Twins Foundation for Abandoned Children had raised over $2 million in 6 months, funded by people who were inspired by the girls' resilience and determination to help others facing similar challenges. "We learned that having a bad father doesn't mean you're destined to have a bad life," Emma explained during a 60 Minutes interview that aired on the anniversary of their kidnapping. "It just means you have to be more creative about building the family and support system you need. Our biological father failed us," Grace added, "but our mother, our extended family, our friends, and even strangers who supported us during the crisis showed us what real love looks like." The twins had also maintained correspondence with Robert Chun, their former kidnapper, who was serving a reduced sentence in federal prison for his cooperation in exposing the Morrison Industries conspiracy. "Mr. Chun made a mistake, but he corrected it when he understood the real impact of his actions," Emma explained. "That's more than we can say for our father, who doubled down on his cruelty even after understanding the consequences." "We've learned that character isn't about never making mistakes," Grace added. "It's about what you do when you realize you've made a mistake." Mr. Chin took responsibility and helped expose the truth. "Our father blamed everyone except himself and refused to acknowledge that he'd done anything wrong." Their relationship with Marcus remained severed. He had made several attempts to contact them through lawyers and family court mediators, but the twins had consistently refused visitation or communication. "We don't hate him," Emma explained. "We just don't trust him. And we don't see any benefit to having someone in our lives who has proven that he'll abandon us whenever it's convenient for him. Maybe someday he'll become the kind of person who deserves to be our father," Grace added. "But that would require him to fundamentally change who he is, and we're not holding our breath." The transformation in Sophia's life had been as dramatic as the destruction of Marcus's empire. The mother who had once struggled to pay for her daughter's school supplies was now financially secure, professionally respected, and emotionally vindicated in ways she had never imagined possible. The GoFundMe account that had been created during the kidnapping crisis had raised over $4 million, far more than the original ransom demand. After covering their immediate needs and establishing college funds for Emma and Grace, Sophia had used the money to complete her medical training and open a clinic specializing in family crisis intervention. The Chun Wellington Family Crisis Center provided free medical care, legal assistance, and counseling services to families dealing with emergency situations. It was funded by ongoing donations from people around the world who had been moved by Sophia's story and inspired by her daughter's courage. But the support we received during our crisis proved that kindness and generosity are more powerful than wealth and selfishness. Do you have any regrets about how public your family's situation became? No regrets about the publicity. If our story helps other families recognize manipulation and abandonment, if it helps other children prepare for the possibility that their parents might fail them, then the public attention was worth it. What about Marcus? Do you have any contact with him now? None. And that's his choice, not mine. He's never apologized for abandoning his daughters. He's never acknowledged that his response was inappropriate. He's never even asked how Emma and Grace are doing emotionally after their ordeal. Do you think he's capable of change? I think anyone is capable of change but Marcus would have to want to become a fundamentally different person, and I don't see evidence that he has that kind of self-awareness or motivation. The legal aftermath of the kidnapping had provided additional vindication for Sophia. The custody arrangement had been modified to give her sole legal and physical custody of Emma and Grace, with Marcus's parental rights suspended indefinitely pending psychological evaluation and family therapy that he had refused to attend. The court finds that Marcus Wellington's response to his children's kidnapping demonstrates a fundamental unfitness for parental responsibility, Judge Patricia Williams had ruled. His choice to prioritize financial considerations over his daughter's safety indicates a lack of basic parental instinct that makes unsupervised contact inappropriate. The child support payments had been increased substantially, though Marcus had fought the modification through multiple appeals. The final settlement required him to pay $50,000 per month for each daughter until they turned 18, plus college expenses and medical costs. It's not about the money, Sophia explained. It's about accountability. Marcus spent years using his wealth to minimize his responsibilities to his children. Now he's learning that abandoning them publicly has consequences that money can't fix. The Morrison Industries executives had been convicted of conspiracy charges and sentenced to significant prison terms. Patricia Morrison herself received 12 years in federal prison for orchestrating the kidnapping conspiracy, while her co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years. The Morrison Industries case sent a clear message that corporate crime involving children will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, U.S. Attorney Michael Chun announced after the sentencing, using children as weapons in business disputes is not just morally reprehensible, it's a federal crime with serious consequences. But for Sophia, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the legal victories or the financial security. It was the knowledge that her daughters had emerged from their ordeal stronger, smarter, and more confident than ever. Emma and Grace taught me something important during their kidnapping, she reflected. They showed me that intelligence and preparation are more powerful than wealth and connections. They survived and thrived because they were smart, not because they were privileged. And they exposed the truth because they were brave, not because they were protected by money or status. Those are lessons that will serve them well throughout their lives, regardless of their father's failures. 2 years after the kidnapping that destroyed his life, Marcus Wellington sat in a modest apartment in Newark, New Jersey, working as a consultant for small pharmaceutical companies that were willing to overlook his reputation in exchange for his technical expertise. The man who had once commanded a billion-dollar empire now earned a fraction of his former income, while living under an assumed name to avoid the public recognition that had made his life unlivable in Manhattan. His forced sale of Wellington Pharmaceutical stock had left him with approximately $200 million, still wealthy by any reasonable standard, but a devastating financial blow for someone accustomed to controlling vast resources. More importantly, his reputation had made it impossible to invest that money in any meaningful way. No legitimate investment firm will work with you, his financial advisor had explained. Your name is toxic in business circles. Any company associated with you faces immediate public backlash and investor flight. Marcus had tried to rehabilitate his image through charitable giving and public apologies, but the efforts had backfired spectacularly. A $10 million donation to children's safety organizations had been rejected and returned with a public statement that the organizations cannot accept money from someone who abandoned his own children in crisis. His attempt to give a televised interview explaining his misunderstood position on ransom payments had become a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons, with viewers mocking his continued attempts to justify his abandonment of Emma and Grace. "I was thinking about the long-term implications," he had told the interviewer. "Paying ransom encourages more kidnappings, which puts more children at risk. But these weren't just any children. These were your daughters. That doesn't change the principle involved. Are you saying that if Emma and Grace were kidnapped again tomorrow, you would still refuse to pay ransom?" Marcus had paused, perhaps finally realizing how his principled stance sounded to normal human beings. "That's a hypothetical situation. It's a yes or no question. Would you pay ransom to save your daughters' lives?" The pause had stretched for nearly 30 seconds of dead air before Marcus answered. "I would have to evaluate the specific circumstances and consider all factors involved." The interview had been viewed over 50 million times, with viewers universally appalled by Marcus's continued inability to simply say he would save his children's lives. It had cemented his reputation as not just a bad father, but as someone fundamentally incapable of normal human emotion. The isolation was complete and devastating. Marcus had no friends, no romantic relationships, no family connections, and no professional colleagues who were willing to associate with him publicly. He spent his days working alone on technical projects and his evenings in an apartment that felt more like a prison than a home. His attempts to contact Emma and Grace had been consistently rebuffed through legal channels. The twins, now 15 years old and thriving in high school, had made it clear through their mother's lawyers that they had no interest in contact with their biological father. "Emma and Grace Wellington have instructed us to inform you that they consider themselves to have no father," their lawyer had written in a formal letter. "They have legally changed their names to Emma Chun and Grace Chun, removing any connection to your family name. Further attempts at contact will be considered harassment." The name change had been a final, devastating blow. Marcus's daughters had literally erased him from their identities, choosing to be known by their mother's maiden name rather than carry any connection to the man who had abandoned them. He had tried to challenge the name change through family court, but Judge Williams had been unsympathetic. "Mr. Wellington, your daughters are 15 years old enough to understand the implications of their choice. They have experienced no contact with you for over 2 years. They have requested no contact with you. And they have demonstrated remarkable maturity and independence despite your absence from their lives. They're my daughters. I have parental rights. You have parental obligations that you abandoned when you refused to save their lives. Rights and obligations are connected, Mr. Wellington. You cannot claim the benefits of fatherhood while refusing the responsibilities. I never abandoned my obligations. You told their mother that their kidnapping was not your problem. That's the definition of abandoning parental obligations." Marcus had appealed the decision, but every court that reviewed the case reached the same conclusion. A man who would abandon his children in crisis had forfeited any claim to their love, respect, or legal connection. Now, sitting alone in his Newark apartment, Marcus finally understood what he had lost. Not just money or reputation or business success, but the only relationships that could have given his life meaning. Emma and Grace had grown up to become remarkable young women despite his absence, honor students, accomplished athletes, volunteer workers who used their experience to help other children in crisis. Their success and happiness was a daily reminder that they were better off without him. Sophia had rebuilt her life into something meaningful and purposeful, using their family's trauma to help other families in crisis. She had found love again with a pediatric surgeon who understood that presence was more important than wealth, who showed up for school events and family dinners and ordinary moments that Marcus had never valued. The family he had destroyed had rebuilt itself without him, stronger and happier than it had ever been when he was part of it. His absence had been a gift to them, though it had cost him everything that might have made his own life worth living. Marcus Wellington had gained the whole world and lost his soul. And unlike the biblical warning, there was no redemption available for purchase, No amount of money that could buy back the love he had abandoned when his daughters needed him most. He was exactly what he had always been, a man who valued everything except the things that actually mattered. The only difference was that now the whole world knew it, and there was no going back. 5 years later, Dr. Emma Chen stood at the podium of the United Nations Youth Assembly, addressing delegates from around the world about children's rights and family crisis intervention. At 20 years old, she was the youngest person ever invited to give a keynote address to the assembly, recognized globally for her work in child advocacy and crisis psychology. 5 years ago, my sister and I were kidnapped as part of a corporate conspiracy designed to manipulate our father, she began, her voice clear and confident. We survived that ordeal not because of wealth or privilege, but because we had prepared for the possibility that the adults in our lives might fail us. The most important lesson we learned wasn't about stranger danger or personal safety. It was about the difference between people who love you conditionally and people who love you unconditionally. In the audience, Grace Chun, now a freshman at Harvard Law School, smiled proudly at her twin sister. Grace had chosen to focus on family law and corporate accountability, inspired by their own experience with adults who used children as weapons in business disputes. Unconditional love shows up when you need it most, Emma continued. It doesn't calculate costs or weigh benefits. It doesn't abandon you when helping becomes inconvenient or expensive. Conditional love, by contrast, always comes with a price tag. It's available when it's easy, absent when it's difficult, and it teaches children that their worth depends on someone else's assessment of their value. Sophia Chin Park sat in the front row with her husband David, the pediatric surgeon who had become the father figure Emma and Grace had never had from their biological parent. David had been present for every important moment in the twins' lives for the past 4 years: graduation ceremonies, college applications, dating advice, and ordinary family dinners that Marcus had never valued. The global community has a responsibility to protect children from adults who would use them as pawns in business disputes, custody battles, or personal vendettas, Emma continued. But more than that, we have a responsibility to teach children that they are worthy of love and protection regardless of their utility to the adults in their lives. My sister and I survived our ordeal because we had one parent who taught us we were valuable simply for being her daughters, and because we had each other. Every child deserves that foundation of unconditional love. After Emma's speech, the Chun Park family gathered for dinner at a small restaurant near the United Nations building. It was the kind of ordinary family celebration that Marcus Wellington had never understood the value of. No expensive wine or exclusive venues. Just people who loved each other sharing a meal and celebrating one member's success. I'm proud of both of you, Sophia told her daughters as they reviewed the day's events. Not just for your accomplishments, but for the women you've become despite the challenges you've faced. We had good teachers, Grace replied, squeezing her mother's hand. You showed us what real love looks like. And David showed us what a real father looks like, Emma added, smiling at her stepfather. Someone who shows up not because he has to, but because he wants to. David, who had never had biological children of his own, had found in Emma and Grace the family he'd always wanted. More importantly, he had given them the consistent, reliable, loving father figure they'd needed to heal from their biological father's abandonment. Family isn't about biology, he reflected. It's about commitment. About choosing to love someone every day, especially when it's difficult. The conversation was interrupted by Grace's phone buzzing with a news alert. She glanced at it and showed the screen to her family. Marcus Wellington arrested for securities fraud, the headline read. Former pharmaceutical CEO charged with insider trading and tax evasion. The family read the article in silence. Marcus's attempts to rebuild his wealth through questionable investments had finally caught up with him. Facing the possibility of federal prison, he had apparently tried to contact Emma and Grace through their college administration offices, hoping they might provide character testimony for his sentencing hearing. The university forwarded his request to us, Emma said quietly. He wants us to speak on his behalf at his trial. What did you tell them? That we have no comment about a man who's been absent from our lives for 5 years. Do you think we should help him? Grace asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Help him how? Sophia replied. By lying about our relationship with him? By pretending he's been a present, loving father when he abandoned us in our most vulnerable moment. He made his choices, Emma said simply. He chose money over his children, business over family, reputation over relationships. He had become irrelevant to their lives in the most complete way possible, not as an enemy to be fought or a wound to be healed, but as a stranger whose choices no longer had any impact on their happiness. As they walked through Manhattan toward their hotel, Emma and Grace reflected on how different their lives might have been if Marcus had chosen differently during their kidnapping crisis. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he had paid the ransom? Grace asked. Sometimes. But I think we're better off this way. How so? Because this way we learned early that we couldn't depend on him. If he had saved us, we might have spent years thinking he actually cared about us, only to be disappointed later when he abandoned us for something else. You think he would have abandoned us eventually anyway? I think people show you who they are, and then you have to decide whether to believe them. Marcus showed us who he was when we needed him most. At least this way, we learned the truth when we were young enough to build our lives around people who actually love us. 20 blocks away, in a federal holding facility in Lower Manhattan, Marcus Wellington sat alone in a cell, finally understanding what he had lost when he chose money over family 5 years earlier. His daughters were thriving without him. His ex-wife had found happiness with someone who understood the value of presence over wealth. The family he had destroyed had rebuilt itself into something stronger and more loving than it had ever been when he was part of it. Marcus Wellington had spent his entire adult life accumulating wealth and power, believing that success was measured by what you owned rather than who loved you. Now, facing the possibility of federal prison with no family to support him and no friends to visit him, he finally understood the difference. But understanding came too late. Some choices can't be undone, some relationships can't be repaired, and some trust can't be rebuilt. Marcus had chosen money over love when it mattered most, and love had moved on without him. The Yendi, if this story moved you, if it showed you the true meaning of family and the real cost of choosing wealth over love, please hit that like button and subscribe to Lux Love Chronicles. Share this with someone who needs to understand that love isn't conditional, family isn't about biology, and some choices have consequences that money can't fix. Remember, the people who love you unconditionally will show up when you need them most, while the people who love you conditionally will always find an excuse to put themselves first. Thank you for joining us on Emma and Grace's journey from abandoned daughters to empowered advocates, from victims to victors, from a broken family to a chosen family built on real love. This is Mr. Wentworth, reminding you that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the people who would sacrifice everything to keep you safe, and who you would sacrifice everything to protect in return. Until next time, choose love over everything else. Because in the end, love is the only thing that actually matters.